Epilogue, on identity. It is difficult to obtain the desired facts when making a study of a family such as mine. My family has a mixture of races that would produce confusion in any genealogical tree. Its history is colorful, to say the least. The social stigmas of the times have spread a dark haze, like unto a huge smoke cloud, around so many of my ancestors that it has been practically impossible for me to trace the line back but a few generations with any degree of clarity or assurance of truth. Anonymous, E. Franklin Fraser Papers. The woman who wrote this family history claimed to be certain of only two things: her mother was a colored woman born in Virginia around 1875, and her father was a white man born in Virginia in 1865. Her family adhered to the social conventions of the Jim Crow South and lived in a black neighborhood. In their father's company and beyond the neighborhood limits, the children could easily pass as white. As one daughter explained, "When we went places with our father and left our mother at home, we could go wherever we wished without question as to race." The children relished these holidays and their father, staggered by his children's blonde-haired, blue-eyed beauty, enjoyed bringing them along wherever he went. Perhaps these days were holidays for him too. He spent most of his life straddling the color line in similar ways as blacks that passed as white. His working world belonged to the white race, his daughter explained, but after work, he returned to a black neighborhood and spent his evenings with his black wife and 7 mixed-race children. Family life continued this way, peacefully and uneventfully, until the father's final wishes conflicted with the life that he lived, casting doubt on his self-identification, and leaving troubling questions for his wife and his children. His daughter puzzled over his last request: "There is one thing surrounding my father's death which has always caused me to feel that he had not reorganized his scheme of life to fit into a world with his colored wife and half-white children." Despite years of discord and estrangement from his white relatives, he made arrangements to be buried in a plot in the white family's cemetery. In death, he wished to be white. When his children visited his grave with their mother, his daughter wrote that white mourners stared at them as if to ask why they had invaded their sacred territory. The phenomenon of passing gave the lie to the notion of sacred territory, even during decades of legalized segregation when racial categories were presumed to be inviolable. But it also left family members struggling to reckon with painful and sometimes unanswerable questions. A history of passing opens a window onto the complexity of the human experience. This practice offers a vehicle for understanding a set of actions that would otherwise vanish from the historical record. A study of passing must take account of the absurdities of the American racial situation, the illogic of the one-drop rule, the possibility of changing one's racial identification by walking across a state line, the reliance of 19th-century judges on experts including hairdressers and foot doctors to determine racial identity in the courtroom, and the belief that race could be revealed through a look in the eye or a bluish tinge on the fingernails. In Langston Hughes's story, Who's Passing for Who?, the revelation that the couple is white after all pokes fun at widely held folk knowledge that blacks were especially attuned to the signs of race and could, borrowing Ralph Ellison's words, spot a paper-thin white Negro every time. This presumption led the owners of segregated movie theaters in Washington, D.C., to hire black spotters to eject passers who took their seats in the white sections rather than the balcony, colloquially known as the nigger heaven. If the lesson from Hughes's story is that black folks could be fooled too and that white folks could do the fooling, then race amounts to little more than a skilled performance and a clever enactment of a role. Sometimes passing was characterized as a joke or a trick. Similar to the Uncle Remus tales of Brer Rabbit and the stories of numerous slave tricksters in African American folklore, passers fooled white folks by trading on racial ambiguity to skillfully maneuver out of a position of weakness, to live out the fantasy of getting over, and to successfully improve their lot. Self-help and self-determination were enduring and fundamental American values, but this racial sleight of hand unnerved and alarmed those who believed in the visibility and certainty of race. Passing reveals the vagaries of race and the farcical nature of racial categorization, but it also produces much more intimate understandings of race and identity, not only as ambiguous analytical tools or social categories, but also as relationships between people. Identity is a series of networks and a set of connections. A question posed by anthropologist James Clifford in The Predicament of Culture underscores identity's relational quality. What if identity is conceived not as a boundary to be maintained but as a nexus of relations and transactions actively engaging a subject? Boundaries are unreliable and easily crossed, but networks and connections inside the boundaries remain foundational to one's identity. The film The Return of Martin Guerre, 1982, elucidates this point. In the film, a clever imposter, Panzette, is welcomed into a family and a village by claiming to be Martin Guerre, an unhappy peasant who abandoned his wife, his child, and his land 9 years earlier. The villagers took note of the obvious physical differences between the new Martin and the old, but Panzet's dazzling memory and his intimate knowledge of Martin's personal life reassured even the most dubious. Panzet's immediate recognition of Martin's sisters, uncle, and neighbors, his vivid reminiscences of youthful pranks and games played 15 years before, and his easy recall of the most private details of Martin's marriage seemed to provide indisputable evidence of his identity. Who else but the real Martin Guerre could know where he left the white hosen before he fled from the village? Or the number of masses needed to break the spell and free him from the humiliation of impotence? Along the way, Panzet must have had accomplices. He likely overheard gossip about Martin and his family. Presumably, neighbors, family members, and even Martin's wife, unwittingly or not, helped Panzet to fashion his new identity and eventually, to become a more authentic Martin than Martin himself. When the real Martin returned to reclaim his wife, his property, and his identity, he performed poorly, bungling the answers to questions about his past. With family cooperation and collaboration, Panzet was able to make Martin's life his own. As in the story of Martin Guerre, those who passed as white remind us that identity is not simply inscribed in one's person. The history of passing enables us to imagine racial identity as an active and close association between people, as a historically contingent relationship that changed in response to various interactions, and in the context of different social spaces. Panzet's gambit foundered before the reappearance of the real Martin in the dramatic finale of The Return of Martin Guerre. This man, as some family members and villagers concluded, could not be Martin Guerre's son, not after violent quarrels with his uncle over his inheritance and his astonishing lack of gratitude for the protection that his family received during his long absence. The deterioration of Panzet's relationships signaled the disintegration of Panzet's identity. His last hope lay in his claim to be the husband of the Honorable Bertrand de Rolls, for who could corroborate the missing man's identity with greater certainty than his own wife? But as a virtuous woman, Bertrand could not afford to stand by the side of the accused man. She had her own identity to preserve. If this man was neither Martin Guerre's son nor the husband of Bertrand de Rolls, then just who was he? Who were his people? He had none. And without people, he was nothing more than an impostor subject to a fitting punishment, arrest and execution. The decision to pass created a profound sense of loss, kin were rejected, networks were disbanded, and connections were broken. Rona Hartfield observed that colored people all over the world immediately ask, "Who are your people?" when they meet each other for the first time, which suggests just how traumatic losing one's people could be. To be sure, there were new people to gain and new relationships to enjoy on the other side, but some experienced the loss of one's family of origin like a phantom limb dangling from the body or clenched in a painful position. The family members were physically gone, yet vivid memories remained. Intermittent reminders and distorted sensations of their presence persisted. In stripping away one's ascribed status, passing offers a sharper angle of vision onto the personal meanings of racial identity from the perspective of African American communities. For Black family members, racial identity aligned with familial affinity, and as such, race became much more about a sense of belonging and completeness, styles of living, memories, stories, desires, and even myths. The most important lesson that can be drawn from a history of passing, then, is a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the ways that races lived and experienced. With only a quick glance, contemporary eyes may view passing as an unconscionable act, the ultimate metaphor of racial and familial abandonment, and the very worst kind of selling out. If we recall Fraser's excoriation of what he observed as a self-hating and apathetic black middle class, we can imagine how his critique might have been amplified when directed at those who turned away from African American life altogether. But by dwelling too long on the theme of race shame, we may overlook the equally compelling theme of race pride. For it was a sense of race pride, and sometimes a desire to dissociate from the shame of passing, that was apparent in rhetorical devices used by a racially ambiguous men and women who immediately identified themselves as black to avoid confusion or embarrassment. In 1872, Robert Harlan made his racial identity known to reporters at the Republican National Convention by announcing, "I look as if I am on the other side, but I am entirely on the dark side." During his short lifetime, Charles Drew, a surgeon and blood plasma pioneer, was known to make a habit of placing himself squarely within the African American community. Lenore Drew, Drew's wife, explained that because Drew's skin was so white, people assumed he was white. Instead of waiting for them to find out he was black, he would say, "When those of us who are Negroes," or some other phrase. He'd let people know right away. Tensions between the feelings of race shame and race pride are best summarized by film scholar J. Ronald Green's formulation of the dichotomy between getting ahead versus making history. Passing was a useful strategy for getting ahead, but it was no way to make history. A number of testimonials published in the black press in the 1950s attested that when a sense of race pride outweighed feelings of race shame, when one worried about the consequences of choosing the lesser part or selling one's birthright for a mess of pottage, making history became a far more honorable pursuit than simply getting ahead. Still, Passing's most urgent and most emotionally freighted questions were not about effective strategies for making history. Instead, Passing broached more personal and intimate themes and underscored an expansive sense of racial affinity. De Shepard's question, "How would anyone know who they were without their people?" lays bare fundamental concerns about identity and expresses puzzlement about the familial dislocations that Passing required. In the end, Passing offers an intimate look at the convoluted and vexing history of race and racial identity in America. By ordering the disavowal of what many found precious about African American life, Passing reveals the most private and the most personal meanings of African American identities. Mixed race identities in the 21st century. The long history of Passing reveals that older racial formations never give way entirely. Shards and fragments of past racial regimes remain visible in contemporary ones. Even in historical moments widely heralded as turning points, when the nation seems to pivot and reverse course, the past still can be seen in the present. This observation does not suggest that nothing is new, but rather that new arrangements are never wholly free of some elements of the old. Racial ideologies are plastic, and they are quick to adapt and reproduce under new social structures. The past is stubborn. Time never begins again. As our present moment unfolds, we are often left to wonder if we have seen this movie before. Without question, racially ambiguous people in the 21st century are living through a very different moment than those who lived in the 1920s or the 1820s. The racial dynamics of the new millennium have created an array of choices that were inconceivable and unavailable to mixed-race people in the past. In the 1920s, Gene Toomer wondered why he had to choose a racial identity. His appeal for a hybrid identity and his statement that to tie me to one of my parts was to lose sick me fell on deaf ears. Toomer was marked, whether he liked it or not, as a great Negro writer, even by close friends who he assumed knew better. When he resisted this title, refused to publish his poems in James Weldon Johnson's anthology, moved to Greenwich Village, and became a follower of the Russian spiritual leader George Gurdjieff, it was assumed then, and is now, among some scholars, that he had chosen to pass for white. In Toomer's time, there were only two options for racially ambiguous people: pass as white or live as black. Regardless of how eloquently Toomer argued for hybridity, his idea never gained traction. The racial constraints of the Jim Crow era would not allow it. By the beginning of the 21st century, the racial landscape had changed and new choices and possibilities emerged. In 2003, Halle Berry became the second African American actress in film history to accept an Academy Award. In her tearful speech, Berry, who is mixed race, accepted the Academy Award by paying tribute to underappreciated African American actresses. She wholeheartedly embraced a singular black racial identity at the Oscars, but afterwards, she had access to a number of racially unmarked roles. After his historic election as the first African American president in 2008, Barack Obama checked African American on the 2010 census but chose not to identify himself as the black president. This decision may have been a personal choice, or it may have been guided by political expediency. Obama had to perform a racial balancing act. First, critics voiced concerns about Obama's sense of racial kinship because he is not a descendant of slaves and the most influential figures in his life have been white, including his mother and his grandparents. To counter these doubts, Obama sprinkled rhetorical flourishes throughout his speeches, and he dazzled observers with his basketball skills. His wife, Michelle, who has a recognizably black American family history, has helped Obama to shore up his racial bona fides. By the 21st century, African American success in the White House and beyond hinged on one's ability to claim a black racial identity, but to transcend it at the same time. This choice, identifying as black but embracing hybridity, is not entirely new. By recognizing both sides of his racially mixed heritage, Obama embodied the qualities of the future American that both Toomer and Charles Chestnut had envisioned in the early 20th century. To be sure, the conditions of the late 20th century and the early 21st century made this approach more possible and more legible to others, but it was not without constraints. There continues to be resistance to the notion of a hybrid identity, or historical antecedents. Passing and the acceptance of racial hybridity function as the two most discernible points on a spectrum of possibilities for those who are racially indeterminate. We might also think of passing and living with hybridity as two interrelated sides of the same coin. In each historical period, passing and hybridity have been possible responses to particular circumstances. The conditions of the 21st century allow for a greater acceptance of hybridity. Obama can find his people in his grandfather's service in General Patton's army and in his father's homeland in Kenya. He can celebrate his mother's family while also enjoying the comfort, the firmness of identity that a name might provide, when he is recognized as his father's son by a British Airways official at the Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi. Beginning in the 1990s, American society began to move toward the end of the spectrum that recognized hybrid identities. This change was reflected not only in personal attitudes and experiences but also in federal racial classifications. In 1993, multiracial activists challenged the one-drop rule and argued that mixed-race people should be officially recognized on the 2000 census. In 1997, the U.S. Census Bureau's policy changed for the first time in almost 80 years to allow individuals to mark one or more categories. Numerous mixed-race organizations, magazines, college classes, and websites appeared and began to garner greater public attention. Suddenly, mixed-race men and women were in vogue. A 2003 article in the Style section of the New York Times named a new crop of Americans Generation E. A, an abbreviation for ethnically ambiguous, and noted the marketing power of this group. The article observed that casting calls for blonde-haired, blue-eyed actors had dwindled and were replaced by calls for actors of color, such as one for a CBS soap opera that requested, light-complexioned African American. Could be part Brazilian or Dominican. According to the New York Times, the look of racial ambiguity was especially profitable for companies that marketed products to a younger set. Linda Wells, Allure magazine's editor-in-chief, explained the fixation on racial hybridity. 5 years ago, about 80% of our covers featured fair-haired blue-eyed women, even though they represented a minority. Uniformity just isn't appealing anymore. New marketing priorities were the result of societal and demographic changes caused by increased levels of immigration and interracial marriage. Interracial marriage increased tenfold between 1960 and 1990, from approximately 150,000 to 1.5 million. The number of mixed-race children born to these marriages skyrocketed from approximately 500,000 to 2 million. As mixed-race author Danzy Senna explained, America had entered the mulatto millennium. In a futuristic parody of the same name, Senna describes her surprise when she wakes one morning to discover she was in style. That mulattoes had taken over. They were everywhere, playing golf, running the airwaves, opening restaurants, modeling clothes, starring in musicals with names like Show Me the Miscegenation. The radio played a steady stream of Lenny Kravitz, Sade, and Mariah Carey. Pure breeds, at least black ones, are out, hybridity is in. Senna had previously identified as a black girl, an enemy of the mulatto nation, who frowned upon those who described themselves as racially mixed. This stance on race was largely because of Senna's upbringing in the 1970s in Boston where mixed wasn't an option. No halvesies. No in-between. Senna chose not to claim a mixed-race identity, but her experience of Boston in the 1970s was remarkably similar to Toomer's experience of Harlem in the 1920s. Few Americans, black or white, were comfortable with the concept of hybridity. But by the late 1990s and the early 2000s, much had changed. The friendly embrace of hybridity in the 21st century neither signals the achievement of a post-racial age nor supports the colorblind thesis that race no longer matters. On the contrary, the increasing acceptance of hybridity underscores just how germane race continues to be to contemporary American society. Some scholars have argued that the chorus of support for a mixed-race movement corresponds with worrisome setbacks to civil rights legislation. A mixed-race movement could vitiate the solidarity needed to press for racial justice. The championing of a multiracial category on the U.S. Census by conservatives has done little to quell this alarm. Some have argued that the addition of a multiracial category coupled with the elimination of affirmative action programs in an overall effort to eradicate racial categories will increase racial harmony. But if racial accounting is interrupted or terminated, compensatory programs, including affirmative action, would be threatened. The claim that without the state's action and intervention the nation would be colorblind is erroneous. Race is reproduced all around us, at every level of society, including in our everyday lives. The state must then be involved to redress the historical and ongoing inequalities that racism has produced. Nations such as France and Brazil that have adopted official policies of race blindness are rife with racial disparities. We are left with a paradox: race must be acknowledged in public policy decisions because attempts to get rid of race result in a deeper entrenchment of racism and racial inequality. Perhaps passing, as traditionally understood, has passed out in the 21st century. But underneath, the core issues of race and identity remain. Hybrid identities are still racialized identities. Racially ambiguous people are racially marked and still must negotiate the terrain of a racist society. Personal choices about how to live with race continue to be tested and contested over time, correlating and shifting with historical circumstances and social structures. New opportunities bring new limitations. Each generation must navigate the social currents and racial realities of its own making.